We're filming today for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive, and we don't often think of the area of upstate New York as a hotbed of jazz, but a great deal of jazz musicians have come out of upstate New York, and we have two of the finest here today, Don Menza, saxophonist, and Sam Noto, trumpet. Welcome to Hamilton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys have shared some common experiences. You're both from Buffalo, is that right?
That's right.
When you were growing up in Buffalo, was there a jazz scene that helped spawn your interest in this kind of music?
Well, just for the archive, Sam is older than me, and by the time I was starting to get into music and starting to play, Sam was already on the scene, and I wasn't old enough to get into a lot of clubs, and he was just past the age limit, so he was, I used to hear him play like at the, first time I saw him really was at the Flamingo on Delaware Avenue, Delaware and Tupper.
Yeah.
Chippewa.
Chippewa. Yeah.
Delaware and Chippewa, and I remember seeing him and Larry Cavelli, also another great saxophonist from, jazz saxophone player from Buffalo, New York, and yeah, there was a jazz scene, and there were a lot of people around, and in those days there were two different unions. There was a black musicians union and a white musicians union, and unfortunately they merged, which became the demise of the black musicians union. But it was a place to go play. Sunday afternoons, jazz sessions, and sessions where you could play, and you used to have to go in and almost sign up backstage and get in line and wait to play. And everybody was very, so far as I was concerned, everybody was very encouraging to help me play and learn how to play, and a lot of great names. The Hackney brothers that played with, both played with Dizzy, didn't they?
Yeah.
Wade Legge, Elvin Shepard. There were a lot of people there. Georgie Clark, saxophone player, and Otis Sutton.
When you say that, unfortunately, the unions merged,
well, I think I'm in the executive board of the local now.
Wait, we don't want to get we don't want to get political about this.
Well, no,
we're not.
I was joking about it.
I'm interested in the scene between black and white musicians at that time, and if
it was healthier back when it was.
It was healthier
separated.
then.
Really.
Than it is now.
Now the blacks don't want to stay into the union. They feel that they don't get enough. But the union doesn't get you work. It's just an organization that in case you're in trouble, nobody pays you or something.
It was a protective society.
Yeah, that's all it is.
And a collection agency, and it isn't like the AFL or CIO or.
Right.
Musicians Union was sort of a gathering of people that wanted to form some kind of common bond and be able to have somebody protect them against club owners that weren't going to pay them or minimum wage scale. It goes, if you go back and look at the beginning of it, it's rather strange.
But when you got called for a particular kind of gig at that time, was it a mixture of players?
Oh, yeah.
You know.
Oh, sure. It was very healthy at the time in Buffalo. We all thought, of course, things aren't happening, but back in those days, they really were happening. It was like Miles and all these bands, Dizzy, they were all coming to Buffalo. There was a venue for them there. So
and more than one.
Oh, yeah. It was a lot of places that really had, top-notch, world-class musicians, And it was healthier in town. There was a lot of local things happening, and much healthier than it is now, although it's picking up again in Buffalo. On the same street we mentioned, Chippewa, it's like, it's like a rejuvenation.
No kidding.
The college people have discovered that area, and they're all coming in and digging the music and hanging out, whatever they do, But it is coming back. In fact, Don and I are playing there Friday night at this club right on Chippewa, and it'll be mobbed. Of course, they love Don in Buffalo. Me, I don't know.
He does all right. We've heard a lot of different stories about how musicians actually learned the craft of jazz. Some of them, that were born in the 20s and mostly learned it on the road. Was this something that you guys, how did you learn your craft?
Well, by doing it, really. You could go and learn all the tunes and the changes and all that, but unless you're out there doing it, there was sessions all over the place. free. You played free, but you were learning. And under the right guidance, there was a lot of great players, and they would help, you know. And that's the way I learned, just by doing. Anyway, probably was the same for you.
Absolutely. There were no schools. There was academia still really hasn't accepted jazz as a quote art form, and they're really, they don't know how to deal with teaching it. I mean, there are so many, like scores of different approaches to it, and some of them work, some of them don't. I find the shortcoming in it, or at least backtracking. When I learned to play, it was learned from records. I had to listen, and then I started to copy. I started to. People say, well, if you think he plays good, you ought to listen to this other guy play. And it was 79 cents, 89 cents, 99 cents for a 10-inch 78 RPM, and go out, wear it out, and go out and buy another one until you got the solo down.
He's not as young as he makes
Yeah, that's
out.
right. 78.
Well, I'm slightly younger than Sam. Not much. But in those days, 3 years was a lot. Or 4 or 5 years was a great deal. If you're 15 and somebody else is 20, that's a big span there.
Yeah, it gets closer as you get older.
Right.
And by the time I had really started to get to the point where I felt I had some technical and musical prowess, Sam was already out on the road on Stan Kenton's band, and by the time he came back, I was in the Army, and then I came back again, he was gone, and then he came back to Buffalo, and that's when it all started.
Okay. But you had an interesting anecdote about your college experience in the practice room.
Oh, at Fredonia.
Yeah.
I went to, I never did graduate from Fredonia. I went there for 3 semesters, and 2 of which were separated by a short tour on the road, and then I went back to school. And while I was at school, I remember the signs on the practice room walls and doors. No jazz playing, and if they caught you, you were suspended.
It's a felony.
Yeah, well, it was some sort of
Dixieland's a misdemeanor.
a major infraction. But it's strange. I wanted to go back to school, and after it was 2 weeks before final exams, and I got a call from Maynard Ferguson. I didn't even say goodbye. The next night, I played my first note at Birdland.
No kidding.
I mean, I just packed up my 55 VW with a cloth sunroof and the idiot stick directionals on the side, jumped in the car and drove to New York.
No question, right?
And there was no question in my mind. Well, I was sort of misled. I didn't have enough money to go to one of the bigger universities. I didn't want to go to North Texas State. For some reason, I didn't want to be that far from the east, from New York. I'm a New Yorker, man. You know, I'm not particularly thrilled about the fact that I moved to California. It was very good to me, but getting to New York and being in the thick of it, feeling it, all those jazz players around you, there was so much history there, man. I couldn't wait to get there. But it was a major infraction. And the jazz players were on the dean's list. I mean, the blacklist.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
No, really.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to belittle them. They didn't understand what it was. They didn't understand who we were and the creative part of it. And when I wanted to go back to school, they turned me down. They felt I was going to be a bad influence on the kids there. A short 8 or 10 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I got an honorary, not really a degree, but a special commendation from the Alumni Association. Dr. Jewett is the man I'm thinking. Remember Jewett Hall?
Yep.
He invented the orthopedic pin. They gave him a special honorarium. There's another. He went to Fredonia. There was another woman who was a state on the state Supreme Court, and she got an honorarium from the, or not an honorarium, but an honorary certificate or whatever. Right. They honored us and me, and I was bewildered. I said, I never graduated from Fredonia.
You wouldn't even let me back in, and now.
And they wouldn't let me, and then here comes, and when they called, I said, who is this? And I thought it was some sort of a put-on. But I went there and I very graciously received it with a great deal of thanks. And everybody went up and gave 10, 15-minute speeches, and I got up in front of them and I had a drink of water, and I looked at them and I held it up and I said, I just want you to know how thrilled I am about this. And it's not for what I've already done. I promise you it's going to be for what I'm going to do.
I think you're making good on that. Applause, please.
And I do. I get out there and I'm very energetic, and I give 1,001% to clinics and symposiums and master classes that I give. I mean, there's not anything I can't help them with. And so be it, you know. And if I can help spread not just jazz music, but music in general. I'm a classical music fanatic. I would give up every note I've ever played or written if I could just once sing the first act of La Boheme in the style of U.C. Bierling or Pavarotti.
Well,
By
you
the
can't.
way-
I'm afraid you have too many good things on record. You can't give them up. But
I would. I'd give it all up. If God came down right now and touched me on the shoulder and put that tenor voice up here where it belongs, you know, in that nasal passage, in a minute, it would be over. No
By the way,
question.
he has influenced my wife because my wife used to listen to jazz records. Now I walk in the house and there's like Luciano Pavarotti on there. He gave her the records. It's constant. I mean, I
Yeah.
love it, you know, but it's constant.
Right.
And she used to be a jazz freak, you know, loved jazz. And
well, I guess as Ellington said, there's good music and bad music.
That's it.
Did he say that? He said a lot of things, but sounds like something he might have said.
Yeah, I think he did say it, yeah.
Sam, how'd the thing with Kenton come about?
well, that was another strange story. I mean, the bus had an accident on the Pennsylvania Turnpike coming to Buffalo to perform. And when they got to Buffalo, Conte Condoli and a few other brass players had hit the seat in front, you know, and they wiped them chops out. And Conte's wife was pregnant, and she cracked her back, a vertebrae, or something, you know. And so he had to leave the band. When they got to Buffalo, they needed 2 trumpet players. So they got, I got the call because I could play a high note. They called the union, you know, it's got somebody who can play high. Well, I mean, he gets high, but I don't know. No, but he's, I played, Joji Holt and I, a black trumpet player in town, we played on the concert that night, and Buddy Childers was the first trumpet player, and we had a little rehearsal in the basement of the theater, and then Stan came up and asked him, you know, how did he do? He said, well, he read the chart, everything was fine. So he says, you want to go on the road for a few weeks until Conte comes back? You know, I said, sure. So I went out, and Conte decided not to come back, and called Stan and said, you know, he's going to stay in California. So then that's how I stayed on the band. It's a weird way to get on a band, but, you know, it's the way it happened.
Stranger things than that have happened.
Yeah. How's Kenton fit into the jazz history as far as you guys are concerned?
Well, I mean, he was I liked the man. He was a great man. I thought, you know, he treated people right, and but I wouldn't say he was a jazz musician. He just liked anything that was progressive and interesting, you know. And as you can tell from his music, there was some very interesting things played, but they were nowhere near jazz, like City of Glass and all these things were really far out for the time, you know. And the closest he got to jazz was in '55, the band we had in 1955, Bill Holman was writing. And then it started to lean towards the swing jazz thing, and they had great soloists. Charlie Mariano, Lenny Niehaus was on, Frank Rossellino, and Carl Fontana, and there was a lot of good soloists on the band. Then the band leaned a little bit more towards jazz. But actually, Stan wasn't really a jazz kind of person or musician. He just wanted interesting music, and you know, it leaned towards jazz.
Yeah, he was an organizer, and he presented and provided a vehicle for the players and the arrangers. He knew how to find the right arrangers for his music. The Bill Holmans, you know, the Jerry Mulligans, the Bill Russos, what's his name? That wrote the Johnny
Richards.
Johnny Richards.
The Cuban Fire album, which is a big
A lot of great writers.
collector's item.
A lot of great writers.
It didn't necessarily have to swing for Stan.
Not
You
for
know
Stan.
what? He did present it. He as a front man, it was priceless. I mean, he was that Toscanini out in front of an orchestra, a jazz orchestra.
He was a great front man.
Yeah, I mean,
The
he'd
arms
walk.
flapping.
I mean, he was like 6'7". He walked out on stage.
No, he was 6'4". No,
I mean,
way.
he was. I mean, he was. I mean, but he had that. He gave you that look when he walked out on stage, like he had. I mean, he'd spread his arms and he'd cover the front of the orchestra.
I'll tell you a story about the swinging thing. When this was in the '55 band, that was about the swingingest band that I ever was on with Kenton. I was with them for 7 years. It was Al Persino and really some swing players. We were in New York. We had a night off, so Al Persino, who was got that voice. I don't know if you know who he is.
Yeah.
But anyway, he said, Count Basie's band is down at Birdland. I think everyone should go down and listen to Count Basie. So we all did, but not because he said it, but we wanted to hear him anyway, And Basie's band was really hot at that time. And Stan Kenton was in the audience, too. I saw him across the room and the whole thing in Birdland. So the next day we get on the bus now. We're leaving New York. We're going somewhere, I don't know, to the next gig. And Al says, Stan, I saw you at Birdland last night. How did you like Count Basie's band? And Stan says, oh, it's great. He says, but all they do is swing. And the whole bus cracked up, man. The whole bus cracked up.
And he did.
But we knew what he meant. That wasn't, that was just the way he thinks about it. He thinks more like in structures and
orchestration,
yeah,
colors,
that kind of thing.
and.
But it was the way he said it was.
And
great.
it's funny. He used to put down some classical music and operas and everything, and yet his concept had to do with that. Had to do with that staging, that kind of presentation. His jazz concerts. I mean, his
I
concerts.
don't remember him putting that down.
Oh,
The only
yeah.
thing I remember
Oh,
him
yeah.
putting down was country western music.
Oh no, he talked
Yeah.
about opera and all that. He hated it, man.
Yeah? I
Yeah,
didn't
and
know
yet,
that.
and yet it had a lot to do with his concept was very much based on that classical sort
Yeah,
of
I think so,
structure.
too. Yeah, right.
But he was a sweetheart. I know. I worked with the band a short time, and a very short time. I had left Maynard's band to go with Stan Kenton, and second night in the band, I gave my notice. It didn't swing.
It was the music, right?
It
You
wasn't. Yes, after Maynard's band, it was such a letdown for me that I called Maynard. I tried to get my job back, and Maynard was furious with me for leaving. And Stan was very sweet. He says, I understand perfectly. And I didn't tell him it ain't swinging. I said, this isn't what I wanted to do. I said, I'm sorry. And I told him, I said, I have the greatest deal of respect for you. And we remained friends till the day he died.
Yeah. It's also interesting that he left, from what I read, he left instructions that he did not want
He
a
did
ghost
not want a
band.
ghost band. And it's happening all over
Well,
the
they
world.
call them tributes, though. see.
Tribute band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he willed his whole library to North Texas State. So that's where all the music is, but there's copies all over the place
Yeah.
now, just running through the machine.
Well, it was, that his music was pretty popular with the college bands.
Oh, sure.
in
It was
their time.
popular. Then, but his music was popular. That was a big time band.
Right.
In the late '40s or early '50s, it was huge.
Well, the band, when I joined, it was the all-star band. It was Lee Konitz, Zoot Sims, and all those people were on that band. And that was a Conti, and then that was close to a swinging band also, because those were all pretty heavy jazz players.
Frank Rossolino was on the band.
Yeah, Frank.
Who?
Well, we're talking about great arrangers. You guys have written a great deal of music yourself, and was it a self-taught thing, or did you, from listening again, trying things out?
Well, actually, he's into the writing maybe more than I am. I was in Vegas in the house bands. I got a little bored with that, so I started studying with one of the trumpet players, Wes Hensel, who was on the band, as far as arranging, And he gave me pointers and that, so I wrote some charts, and But Don is really into the writing,
Right.
and I don't write as much as I should really anymore, But
You wrote some things for Rob McConnell, didn't you?
no.
No?
I played on a
Okay.
couple.
All right.
No, I've never written.
All right.
I've written a bunch of things that I played in Buffalo with a local band.
Yeah.
We put a concert on, but I've never. Louis Bellson played one of my charts to his big band, called A Couple of Dozen, which is based on a Rowe, you know,
A tone row?
a tone Rowe,
Oh.
yeah.
Not a monk row.
Not a monk row. You don't want to base a tune on that.
Gee, that was
good.
I forgot. See, I made a pun and I didn't know it.
Well, Don, I think that there's probably a significant number of saxophone players in this country who have a kind of a love-hate relationship with you.
It's cool. So long as they know who, so long as they, it doesn't matter. You know, the saxophone parts, it's nothing, everything that I've written, I've played.
Uh-huh.
It's all based
playable.
on my small group
Yeah.
concept, all my big band charts,
Right.
everything. It's a mood that I've experienced on the bandstand, and I've translated it to the big band, you know,
Right.
to be able to like organize it in that sense.
Right.
I started writing in Buffalo a long time ago. I was always very inquisitive. I wanted to know, how does he get that sound? How does he make that? How does he do this? There were the early arrangers early on were Bill Holman. I loved that linear writing that he did. Oliver Nelson, Gil Evans, and I can't think of any arrangers or writers that haven't touched me one way or another. And I finally came up with some sort of a concept. The classical music thing really got to me, because then I wanted to know about, how do I orchestrate? How do I get this sound? How do I get that kind of sound from doubling? And I went to the scores. I learned string writing from all the operas, from all the classical writers. There's so much out there, and I have this insatiable appetite to try and do it all.
He's a workaholic, is what he is.
Nah, not really. I mean,
No, he
I
doesn't
do
have a lot of energy.
I do have my moments away from music, and it's
Yeah.
sometimes I even abuse the fact that I should be. I mean, that I'm taking a little time off. You know, I'm into
See what I mean?
model.
Workaholic.
I'm into model railroads, and I forget about my practicing, and my horn suddenly, and my writing takes a back seat. But the last few months, I've been real busy at it. I just finished doing about 6 things for Orange Coast College. There's some things coming up, and the writing thing, I never really studied, except with the best writers. I tried to copy things that I heard on record.
Yeah.
And it's getting easier and easier. Now when I hear something, I recognize it. I can relate it to something I've seen on paper, or something I did. It's that, but he added this, or he did. And I never really went to school for arranging. There's a trap in the schools that teach this, especially with the kids with the computers. They are a slave to that. They don't try anything and make the mistake. They hear it there, doesn't work, they change it, and it's gone. The computer remembers it, but they don't.
Yeah.
It's a huge trap. And a lot of the people that write with computers, it sounds that way. If they were going to pick up their saxophone or their flute or their trumpet or the piano and play it on the piano, they wouldn't write that. On the computer, it's there. They do it very slowly, and then hand the part to a player and expect him to play it.
Yeah.
And there's not a breath for like 16 bars. Where do you breathe?
The computer doesn't need to breathe.
I'm
right?
just going through this with a saxophone player who's very talented and a very talented writer. He's going to be incredible. And he came in with a shout chorus. He's got trumpet starting on a high D above the staff. His written note, D, E's, F's, D. And he wanted to use a classical a term that's called a motor rhythm, which Stravinsky used all the time. He'd get this one thing going like dee da da dee da da dee from Firebird, and underneath it there's this boom
I like that
da, and he's got these 2 different things happening, dee doo doo dee, and it's like a motor rhythm that starts, and the machine starts, and not every wheel turns the same number of. It's that effect that you get. Well, he's got the trumpet player playing this.
Wiping the poor guy out.
I said, when is he going to breathe? You got to write it. I said, you wouldn't write that if you were playing it on your flute or your piccolo or your tenor. You'd realize I have to take the horn out of my mouth and breathe.
Yeah.
I think
That's the trap. That's the trap.
I think the space in music is just as important as the notes. You know, you get a
Right.
person like an individualist and an innovator like Miles Davis. I mean, he played one note and the beat's going on, and
he waited.
made you hear a bunch of other notes.
You would lean forward, waiting for the next. You're trying to outguess where he was going to put it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the space is important then, you know.
And you played with another master of that, with Count Basie, right?
Yeah, well, that's another story. You know, when I first got on the band, I thought I was sticking out like a sore thumb, because the band was all in its groove and relaxed, and some of the sections played in different time areas than the other section, until the ensemble came, and then it just took off, you know. And at first, I mean, I was having a little problem, you know, playing with that much relaxation with intensity. It's like a relaxed intensity that you had to get, you know. And of course, after a week or so, and you started to feel that thing, and it was quite a treat for me. I mean, I played on one of the better Basie bands too. It was
That was in
pretty
the 60s?
60s. I was on 2 tours I made with Basie, 64 and 65, I think it was. You know. Great man, I loved him, man, Basie. Never wasted any words. Just the way he played is the way he was, you know.
Yeah.
It was, if he liked you, man, he liked you. And he seemed to like me for some reason, but we got along great. I thought he was a great musician, too. He never got in the way. I used to play solos on April in Paris and all that stuff, and he hit the chord just when you needed it, man. Never overplayed.
Did you feel like, I mean, in listening to you play last night, it sounded to me like Dizzy Gillespie listened to you when...
Oh, no, I don't know about that. Dizzy was a good friend of mine when I joined Kenton's band. Dizzy was on that tour, you know, it was a big package tour, and Charlie Parker was also.
Yeah.
So I got to hear these guys for 3 months every night. So I was hanging around with Dizzy, and there's a lot of Dizzy in me. I mean, he was one of my first influences. And then, of course, Miles and Clifford and Fats Navarro was a big influence. But, you know, it's nice for you to say, but it doesn't work that way.
Well, in playing with Basie, did you have to alter your style some to fit that, or did it just seem to work?
Not my style. It was just where the time was, you know. Because we usually play up on the time, you know, and the bands played right on the time, sometime a little back. So that was a little bit of an adjustment. But style, no, I played that Thad Jones chair, you know, which was the modern kind of trumpet.
Oh.
And then Joe Newman played the other trumpet chair, which was, you know, more traditional. But Joe wasn't on the band when I was. It was Albert Ahrens, who was also a fine lyrical player, beautiful player. And I know Don knows him too. Yeah. And it was great, man. I mean, it was a great experience.
And you both have, well, been with Louis Bellson on and off, Don for quite a while, right?
My stints were Stan Kenton. I mean, in the beginning was El Boleto, the band out of New Orleans, and then Maynard Ferguson and Stan Kenton, and then the European thing with the Max Greger Big Band in Munich, and then coming back, and I went with Buddy Rich, and then Louis Bellson, and of course Henry Mancini. I worked with Henry for like almost 30 years. Oh. But I have to say, in all the band leaders that I worked for, Buddy was the one. It's a great shame I didn't get to work with Basie. I talked with Basie a couple times. He heard me play with Louis, and he said, "I'd like you to play with the band sometime." And my heart started beating. I would love to have gone on that band and played with that band. And it's after the fact now. I don't want to do it the Ghost Band. I wouldn't consider it. But to have done it when Basie was there and been around him and been able to, like, hands-on with all the history and yeah, that would have been a thrill, because my likes lean toward that kind of big band. I mean, that kind of swing, that kind of energy that band had. I loved it. Well, but getting back to it, like, of all the, because this has to be documented, Buddy Rich was the only real band leader I ever worked for. He told you truths. Mediocrity did not exist in his vocabulary. He was very hard on people, and he expected them to give as much as he did in the band. But if something went wrong with the band, I mean, something happened, if there was any kind of scene, he'd push everybody out of the way. He'd say, "You deal with me. This is my band." I know some of the leaders, and they were all very good, they'd back up and it's your problem. You deal with it, you know. You got it. Buddy was incredible. He knew exactly what he wanted out of a piece of music. And he'd sit out front. He didn't read. He had a lot of insecurities with, and he never gave you that impression with how he played. He had a lot of insecurities. He didn't read any music. He didn't know a lot about music, except he knew what was good and he knew what he liked. Nothing more, nothing less. And if you stood up to play and you stepped on it, you can be sure you would never stand up to play again.
He's a hard man. Yeah.
Well, it's good to hear. I mean, you phrase it in a positive sense. That he was a...
Well, the people that put him down are the people that were mediocre and that couldn't play, and they hated him. I think it's a very simple. I mean, you talk to Sweets Edison about Buddy, and he says, "Oh man," I mean, he gets like rekindled. You get ready to play, man, and Buddy'd be there, and he'd be propelling you along, making it easier for you to play.
He loved upstate people too. Joe Romano, Pat LaBarre, all these people. Don
Sal Listico played, right?
Sal, he loved those upstate players because there was a lot of certain energy coming from the upstate people, you know, right from Buffalo all the way down to New York. It's like,
and you know, of course, the great line from Buddy Rich when he was getting ready to go in for brain surgery. The anesthesiologist asked him, they were getting ready to wheel him in, they said, "Mr. Rich, is there anything you know of that you're allergic to?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Country music." on his deathbed, he still had that kind of dry sense of humor. I have a video somebody just sent me of Buddy Rich singing and dancing and playing. I mean, it's an hour-long video of him on the Ed Sullivan Show, on this show, on that show, and he does a song and dance routine on the Steve Allen Show, and you should see him tap dance. I mean, it's nothing short of Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire. And he could improvise. He could get out there and do the whole thing.
I saw him in Batavia, New York, a long time ago.
He was an incredible talent.
At the Mancuso Theater, and he was dancing then.
That comes out of that vaudeville training.
I may have been about 15, 16. We went down with my older brother.
Well, what a great thing for a drummer, you know, to
and he
start
could
with
sing.
the
rhythm.
He could sing too. I mean, and on this tape, it's like a song and dance and play routine. He comes out, he sings this song, he does a little tap dancing with a big arrangement that they had done for Steve Allen's show. And then he sings some more, and then he suddenly winds up on drums and plays this tremendous shout chorus with the band, and then this tremendous solo. And then he stands up and he said, "That was nothing." And for him, it was.
Well, I have to ask you about the recording you made. Of course, in fact, even in the Grove Dictionary of Jazz, it mentions Channel One Suite, and it seems like there's been certain times in jazz history where people have recorded things. Illinois Jacquet with his, I guess it was Flying Home, and Coleman Hawkins, Body and Soul.
Stan Getz Early Autumn.
And this particular recording, I'm interested in, was that the only live recording done of that particular chart, first of all?
No, there's a new recording that's coming out on CD. It was live at Ronnie Scott's. It was Buddy Rich's 50th birthday, and they're reissuing that. There's also a beautiful concert hall where Benjamin Britten used to go and give his premiere performances up not Canada, north of London, called Maltings. Maltings on the Snapes. Snapes are like it's like a swamp area, bogs.
Marsh or
bogs and marshes. Yeah, that's what they are. But Maltings is a beautiful old concert hall, very, very experimental, and a lot of flat surfaces, reflecting. And anyway, we did a television show there, and it was recorded there. There is a studio recording of that same album, of the Mercy Mercy album, that got shelved because we were in Buffalo, New York on my birthday in 1967. or 1968, and Buddy, I remember Buddy telling me as I was playing more and more, the cadenzas got longer. He said, stretch out. So in Buffalo, on my birthday, I really took it out and did a 5-minute cadenza in one breath, you know, circular breathing and everything. And he went out in front and dropped a cigarette, and he said, oops, it's one of those Don Menza roll your own, you know. This is at Kleinen's Music Hall, right? It's, you know, and I'm saying, oh no, you know, and I was going to be I was going to be the brunt of his jokes all night. He said, why didn't you play like that on the record? And I said, well, you told me to play shorter. I said, but now that the band sounds so good, why don't you do the record live? And he said, get your own band, kid. You know, like, this is in front of 3,000 people.
Yeah.
Well, the wind-up was, 2 days later, he gets on the bus and he says, and everybody get your act together. And he said, if we're playing good now, I want it even better. We're going to do the album live at Caesar's Palace in July.
I was backstage when you guys did that.
No
I was working across the street.
And we did it, and that's the gospel truth. That's exactly how that, and Liberty or Pacific Jazz still has the studio recordings of those tapes.
Well, you've probably had people tell you this before, but you know, my roommate and I just used to sit and listen to that piece over and over and over, and I was one of the unfortunate people that, you know, of course, our college band got the arrangement, and I had the part, you know, so no matter what you did, you could play really well, but everybody's, well, sure wasn't much like what Don played.
You know, I played it every night, and I had a bag of tricks, and the bag kept getting bigger and bigger, and I had all the space in the world. He never told me, hey, cut it short. He never once said that, no matter how long or how absurd or bizarre I got with what I played. He says, you got it, that's your, and people said, you have to see him on the drums in back of you. And he's got his foot up on the bass drum, and he's listening, looking at me, laughing, you know, and like sometimes he'd egg me on, yeah, that's it, go ahead, you know. He said, screaming at me, you know. And it was great. He gave me all the space in the world. He never once handcuffed me. Okay, one night, Joe Romano and I partied all day in New York. My daughter had just been born. This was October of '68, and we were working at the Riverboat. And Joe Romano and I walked in, and I had bought a box of Havana cigars, and we had been drinking all day, and we walked in, and we did look a bit disheveled, you know, and I'm trying not to look at him, you know, and the Riverboat, they had buttons on the floor right where I sat, and I have to press the button to turn the lights on, and then there's another button to step on to open the curtains. Well, I could see him looking at Joe, and Joe has this classic look about when he's been partying too much, his hair down in front of his face. I didn't have that luxury, you know. and Joe is sitting there, and he's you know, it's like warming up, and Buddy goes over and pulls his locks from his eyes, and he said, and then he looks down at me, and I'm fooling with my reed. I'm trying not to look at it, you know, and of course with me, my eyes are bright red. And I'm trying not to look at him, and he said, and he says, okay. He says, Willow Crest, which is a tenor alto feature. And he used to play it fast, in 3, you know, and he'd start playing, and he'd scream, Willow Crest. He says, Menza, get the lights, get the curtains. Well, I reach over and press this thing, and all the lights go out. I pressed the wrong button. And then he says, the lights. And I'm trying to, and the lights are blinking on and off, and I can't get the curtain thing to work. And finally I stand up, and I'm trying to find the button, and I'm looking at him, and I'm like this, and I press this button, the lights go on, the curtains open, and I'm out in front of the band, like looking at it, and he's cut the band off. He said, this isn't your band. He comes out and closes the curtain, and he got on my case and Joe's case. He said, you guys ever come on my bandstand like this again? And then he started laughing. He said, what have you been doing all day? And the people are waiting for the concert. I said, my daughter was born last night. He says, congratulations. He said, you didn't bring me anything? I said, yeah, I got you a cigar. I got a bottle of wine. I got a bottle of cognac. He said, come here, Trey. He lights a cigar, pour him a bottle of cognac, and the curtain opens, and he starts talking to the people about my daughter.
He's nuts. He was nuts, man.
Oh,
Buddy was a natural guy. He just did what he thought at that minute, you know?
Yeah.
And that night is the night where my father-in-law and all my relatives from Long Island were in to the Riverboat to hear us play. And we went up to the bar, and they wouldn't let us stand at the bar. They says, this isn't for the band. You guys go down. I says, don't move. And I went down. I said, hey, buddy, They won't let us, my family's up there. He says, who? And he's in the dressing room, slippers, this is after the first set, with a bathrobe, and he's had his tube off. He says, who? He walked straight through the club, up a big circular staircase that looked like Gone with the Wind. He says, where? I said, that guy over there. He says, you ever mess with my band again? He says, we're out of here. He says, guys, the drinks are on me.
Oh, man, that's great stuff.
But he was incredible. Yeah, that's, you know, like, you hear a lot of bad stories. A lot of people don't like him. A lot of people, he was too arrogant and everything. He was a pussycat. He really was. And I tell you, he's sorely missed. That's the kind of drummer that helps. He knows about playing the time. He knows about when to get exciting. You know, maybe not my favorite way of playing, but I never heard anybody play any better.
There's like a little bit of a negative story on that thing. It's a joke, you know, but this guy calls after Buddy had passed and calls Buddy's number, and I guess his wife or somebody's daughter answers the phone. It says, is Buddy Rich there, please? Big lull, you know, and says, well, Buddy passed on, you know. He says, oh, okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Oh, jeez.
I mean, that's
I heard the same
Yeah.
thing about the same thing about Benny Goodman.
Right.
Well,
It's a
that's
joke.
That's
Sure.
another
Yeah, this-
whole hour program, Benny Goodman.
Right. We've had some stories, but you know, most musicians are fairly protective of one another.
Oh yeah, most of the time.
I really enjoyed your perspective on him because
It's different from what you.
yeah.
I mean, it's unreal. When he was in the hospital, I remember going to see him. I was on my way to Europe, and Chuck Finley and Joe Romano stopped to see him. You know, we had a ride to the airport, so we stopped at UCLA, and this was just after his operation, and his left arm was gone. His left arm was totally paralyzed. We never saw him again. He had died while we were in Europe, and his left arm was paralyzed, and he'd be laying there, and every time he'd yawn, his arm would raise. There was something in the nerve system and everything, and his arm would go up and then fall. And while we were there, Jake Hanna came in, and Jake went over and gave him a hug, and Buddy started crying, and he was, you know, he was a very humble man, really. And he said, Buddy, he said, you're going to be all right. You play more with one hand. And he said, no, Jake, look at this. And he picked up his hand and dropped it, and Jake, in his quick sense of, fast, sharp sense of humor, looked at Buddy, and he says, now you know how we feel when we hear you play.
Oh boy, that's great. Sam, when you played in Vegas, that was a pretty happening town for music, live music?
You mean when I was living there? I lived there for 7 years,
Yeah.
but I just played in the house bands and that, you know, and I wasn't too happy there, and you know, it's just one-dimension town.
Showbiz.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that musicians do throughout their career that
You make compromises.
Necessity.
You
Well,
do
you have
what
to.
you have to do.
You have to, you know. It's just
I've been
either
fortunate.
that, I worked days too. I drove cabs and worked in a car battery factory and the whole thing. It's just whatever comes up, you know. I mean, I'm a family man. I come from a very strong type family, so that's the way I felt. I mean, if I couldn't do it playing the trumpet, I had to do something, keep some bread coming in, you know. So, I mean, I've done a lot of things, and that's why I decided to move to Vegas. I was making $82.50 a week in a car battery factory, and that's 5.5 days a week. So I figured, well, you know, I could make more money by blowing the trumpet, even if it's not the way I want to blow it, you know. So I went to Vegas and got into house bands and making $500 a week, and everybody was happy, except me. And well, but we played though. We used to play in people's houses after the gig. You know, we used to go to Roy Shane. He had
I
a
used
big,
to go up to see him.
big
Used to go and hang out for
recording
3
studio
days.
in his garage. He'd turn the tape on. We'd play all night. He must have tapes that, you know,
My
were
wife-
wall full.
It's interesting. It was one of the first time I could really show her what was happening. She wanted to come with me, and we drove up to Vegas, and we went to see Sam. We saw a couple of different shows and everything. And I said, you're going to come up, and you're going to hang with us for 3 days. You're going to see what we do, because anytime, you know, 4 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock sunrise, you're walking in after leaving like at 6 o'clock the night before. Where do you go? What do you do? You
Think
know?
it's another
And pretty
woman
soon,
instead of
you
his
know,
horn,
like
man.
I said, you're going to hang with us. You're going to see. Well, after a day and a half, she says, drop me off at the hotel. Do what you want. She couldn't believe it, that this, the life of hanging out and playing, and those moments, more great choruses were lost forever, have disappeared into air. At sessions at 3 o'clock in the morning in Harlem and jazz kellers in Germany or little roadside cafes where somebody felt like playing and took out their horn and went up and played with the rhythm section, you know, and on a Sunday afternoon. There used to be places in Buffalo that were, I mean, all over the world there were places where you could go and play and you could practice. Now you'd practice, but you'd go out and show your wares.
Couldn't buy any groceries though.
No, it was, and it was for the love of it. We learned to play for the love of it, not because we thought we were going to make a living on it.
You even owned a club too, didn't you?
Yeah, I had two actually. The first one was in the mid-'60s. It was a coffee house. I couldn't get a booze license, so that lasted about a year, and it was great. And people, after we stay open till 6 in the morning, after the bars close, they'd all line up and have steak and eggs at my place and hear music all night. Joe Romano and I had a group there like for a whole year. But then the last venture was about '82. I had the whole ball of wax then, the bar and the booze and the whole thing, but it was in a bad area, and it was between the black and white line there, and the whites were afraid to come, and the blacks wouldn't come because it was a white owner. So that place went down fast, real fast. That was all my money too.
Was it called the Renaissance?
Yeah, they were both called Renaissance. The first one was a Renaissance, and the other one was a Renaissance too. And I had some good people. I had Chet Baker in there, and Al Cohen, and David Schnitter come in and play with Pepper Adams. I had some good people there, but nobody would come to hear him. They did come to hear Chet, and they did come to hear Don. They you know, disregarded whatever area it was from, you know. So Chet Baker was there for 3 days and was mobbed every night. I charged $7 at the door, and people were complaining.
Right.
You know, $7, Sam. I said, hey man, Chet Baker, how am I going to pay this guy?
Right.
The drinks were $1.75. I mean, drinks though, you know.
Yeah, real drinks.
Yeah.
Owning a club I think is a tough business.
It's a hard road to go. People don't have any idea. Just the organization of it alone, just booking somebody for one night a week, 52 weeks a year, is a full-time job. It's incredible.
I mean, I know both ends of the stick on that one,
Yeah.
you know. That's why I feel for a guy like in Tiny's, you know, and any club owner. I know what it takes to pay the musicians and still try to come out, you know, with your head above water, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think, I guess in the 40s and when this kind of music was the popular music, that with all the bands touring and so forth, it certainly has changed.
Huh. Well, there's still a big audience for this kind of music, but everybody's a little afraid to come out anymore. You know, like if the cops are going to be there busting them if they have a drink and that kind of thing, and they stay home. They play the records that they.
Nightlife has changed,
you know, it's a bit
drastically.
different. Yeah.
I mean, it used to be where the urban situation was all, I mean, centrally located. It was easy. There were a lot of people there. There was a certain amount of security. You didn't have to worry about being bowled over by a bunch of thugs or by some gang members or something. I mean, there were still problems, but in any large city that's going to happen. But there seemed to be a certain amount of like safety, or you felt secure going downtown. A lot of bright lights. Everything was there. The theaters, the restaurants, the jazz clubs, the little bars, and you seem to know everybody. They've done away with that. If you want to go somewhere to hear music, you have to drive clear across town to some dark little shopping plaza that's closed except for this one thing, and park across like a quarter of a mile away, and
or else you go to a concert hall. I think
and
some of the things
halls,
that ruined the whole club scene were the concert halls and the big money that these bands demanded. You
It's
know,
big
thousands
business.
of dollars. You know.
not to mention what they're presenting as jazz in the concert halls.
Well, it's interesting because I've often wondered when, even with guys like yourself, and when you were learning jazz, did you think of it as an art form? Did you think of it as high art?
Absolutely, it was a
You did.
It was a yes, it was
Okay.
It was a creative art form, and I mean I don't remember using those exact, but there was a mystique about it, and anytime I got ready to ask a musician who I thought was accomplished at all, maybe not a jazz player, but when I asked them about the jazz players and how do you learn to do that, they didn't know. They said, oh, he just makes that up.
Ah, plays anything he wants.
Yeah, anything he wants. A lot of wrong notes. He plays out of tune in that. And I didn't hear that. What I felt was the spontaneity, the inventiveness of it. And it was always exciting to hear 3 saxophone players playing on the same horn, same mouthpiece, and they all sounded different. It just didn't sound like 20 violin players sounding the same. And that isn't quite true either, you know.
Yeah.
But
Well, with me, it was, I never thought of it as an art form or that. I just heard it, and I said, well, this is what I want to do. And I thought if I got good enough at this, you know, I could possibly make a living doing this, you know, which is a big mistake, you know. Even like the Charlie Parkers couldn't make a living, you know, who was, to me, you know, one of the best, or the best jazz player around, but ever, you know, but I dug it. I mean, there was something vital about it, you know. That it was tell the whole story about life, and I just fell in love with it. And before that, I used to listen to Harry James, who's a great player and everything. But when the bebop thing came out, it changed my whole life, you know. And I keep telling all these guys, man, I could have been another Harry James.
The timing was a little off there.
No,
I think the thing about what Sam says, we agree on it 1,000%. I think it was the unpredictability of the jazz players. I mean, you could go there and you never knew what was going to happen, and this is what makes puts the vitalness, the vitality in the music.
I play in Toronto a lot. You know, I have a group up there, and there's a lot. All college kids come to hear us now, and they're really into it. And the more we get into the music, the more they like it. I mean, you know, it's really intriguing. Improvisation is intriguing in every aspect of the word and in every business, you know. So when something happens like that, man, it's great, you know, the spontaneity of it and a quick, good idea, no matter what you're doing, whatever end of the business or spectrum.
And it's funny, the whole world looks at jazz players and jazz music as a vital art form, as a very important art form of the last 50 or 100 years. Not here. Now they just started sort of like coming around to it, but not here. If Woody Herman had gone through his number like he did when he was dying and when the IRS was ready to wheel his bed out on the street and take his house from him, anywhere else in the world, he's a hero. He would have been a national hero. Not here. It's rather sad.
I think somebody bailed him out. I hate to mention his name.
Yeah, it's
'cause
okay.
I can't stand him.
That's all right.
Frank Sinatra bailed him out a little bit, helped him out, you know.
Yeah, he did.
But I think he let everybody know it too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, well.
Not one of my favorites.
Well, I've always felt that sometimes we look on music that comes from somewhere else as being more worthwhile, having the exotic end of it, and something that's homegrown, that we sometimes take advantage of it. But
Right.
I also think maybe when dancing, for whatever reason, became separated from the music, that changed it somewhat. And sometimes it seems kind of odd to be listening to...
They used to dance to jazz. I mean,
Right.
to like the bebop, even the bebop era, they had
That's
a
right.
special dance that they did. I mean, not just a special dance, but it was a concept, and they improvised out there, just like the players did.
Late 40s in Buffalo, there was a place on the east side called Amity Hall, and there was a big poster out front, Charlie Parker Quintet, you know, and it was a dance hall. and it was Charlie Parker, Kenny Dorham. I mean, it was a great band, you know, and they were playing, and people were dancing. I mean, it was a dance. We were standing in the corner listening. People were listening. People were dancing, you know. And I thought that was pretty healthy. You know, at the time, you know, I'm not a dancer, you know, so, you know, I don't know exactly what people get out of dancing. They must get something out of it. But I thought it was healthy because no matter what tempo, they tried to dance. And Bird would play some fast tempos, you know. Kenny Dorham blown away there, man. It's beautiful.
Well, it does seem kind of odd sometimes to be listening to, let's say, the Count Basie Orchestra in a concert hall, and they're, you know, they're just swinging and swinging.
Really,
and
yeah.
People almost should be dancing to this music.
They did.
A lot
Yeah,
did.
of
You know,
course
remember
they
that,
did.
But now,
the Paramount
it's not
and-
presented in that fashion.
No, it isn't.
I
That's
don't know
right.
if it's right or
Yeah.
wrong. It's just.
I don't know either if it's right or
you
wrong,
get,
but I know
if
it's
in concert halls. In concert halls, very often you get so far away from the music that you lose that communication, that line of communication.
I think you also get the musician who's trying to be on his best behavior. I think he has something. He loses something in that performance because he wants to be perfect.
Yeah, he's under a microscope, under a magnifying
everybody's
glass.
relaxing, you know, and this guy may step out and do something really good above his head for a minute, and then you know, work off of that and learn something. See, but I think it gets more contrived, you know, as it's presented in a concert way. Like, you know, classical music is all on the paper. You know, it's you know, save maybe a violinist doing a thing, you know, like a cadenza or whatever, but it's there. You do that, and the beauty of that is to do that properly. But jazz is different. You do, when it comes naturally and spontaneously, is the best part. So sometimes in a concert hall, you may lose some of that.
Interesting concept. There's a whole group of jazz players and a school of jazz players who believe find a good solo and stay with it.
Yeah.
And they play it the same way. They play the record version every night. Then there are the players who don't, who play, and every time they play, they go looking for new things. And everybody has their thumbprint. They repeat little nuances that they do. But I would tend to lean towards that. A variation on the same theme.
Yeah, you can play the same
And where
tune
does the
every
creativity end? I mean, when you play the one solo and then you do it every time that way, then it's not creative anymore.
Well, I got a kick out of last night when you guys were playing and you did All the Things You Are, which I'm almost always going to hear at a certain tempo. You know, most people are going to play it at a fairly up tempo, and you guys
You never know what's going to happen.
were
with me and
like
I.
way back with the tempos.
You
It's
never
crazy.
know what we're going to play.
And it allows you to play, forces you to play a little different. And then you did the next tune, I can't remember the tune, which is usually a ballad, and you did it up. You know, I said, what a great way to prod yourself into.
You gotta.
Well, I think it's interesting for the listener too. See, now the reason you're saying that, like it did, you know, it rang something in your brain, right? And
Yeah.
so I
Push
mean,
the button.
Yeah.
That's what the music is supposed to do. It's not supposed to be just one way all the time. That's what he's talking about, that same solo thing.
You know, even-
I mean, I don't know how anybody can do that. I don't remember what I played the last time anyway. What was the point?
Yeah.
You know.
Even with the great classical players, I've heard Pavarotti say, "I'm an interpretive artist." He's taken that, and I think that's what made him, what put him over the edge so far as popularity, is that he just doesn't go out there and sing it like all the other great tenors that have come before him. There's something just a little bit different about him. James Galway is that way. He considers himself an interpretive artist. He plays the same old Mozart, which I hold him with a great deal of reverence. He plays the same Mozart concertos that everybody else played, but here comes this man playing it, and he made it come alive. And suddenly, there's a vitality in it, and
It's an interpretation.
there's an urgency in the music that I've heard a million times. It's very interesting to hear people do that, take that printed page, and why does it sound so much better than the guy who played it last time? Who played it perfect? It's that little edge, that little bit of interpretation where you take things and here comes my personality.
Well, this has really been fascinating. You guys have given us some great stories. I didn't get to ask you about your LA days too much, but you had
LA is
lots
what it
of
is, La La.
studio work.
Oh,
right?
yeah. And I have to say, one of the really great thrills of my life was working with Henry Mancini, and I sorely miss him. And he was exactly like his music. He made a big influence huge influence on me, like so far as my writing, arranging, seeing him in front of an orchestra. A great story from Mancini is when Pavarotti did his movie, I asked Hank, I said, Hank, are you gonna, and on his birth certificate it says Enrico, his real name was Enrico. I said, hey, Hank, I said, you gonna do the movie? He said, oh no, they're gonna get a classical, you know. Well, John Williams did it, and he wrote the song for the movie and everything. 3 years later, we're celebrating, my wife and I are celebrating our 25th anniversary, and we're in San Francisco, and we check into the hotel, and here's the flowers and champagne and the whole thing, and Hank calls me. He says, you gonna come with me to rehearsal? I said, well, Rose is with me. He said, I know, bring her. He said, I gotta talk to you. And I said, he wants to talk to me? I wonder what. Like, he calls me when he wants to talk to me. We get in the limo, and we said, he pops, hands me a cigar, happy anniversary, we're drinking, and Rose loved him. He was great, and he looks at me, he says, I just got a call from New York. They want me to write Pavarotti's next album. I said, I told ya. Well, I tried to find out where they were going to do it, and I wanted to go, I wanted to be there, I wanted to be part of it, just to witness it. And they wanted to do it in Geneva, Switzerland, because he was performing, he was singing Ballo and Mascara, Giuseppe Verdi. Well, it's not for me, is it?
You're late for a gig. We hope not.
Get me on it.
Are we supposed to be somewhere?
Anyway, the wind-up was he calls me as soon as he came back from the recording sessions, and he says, or Rose says, Don, it's Hank. I said, Hank who? He says, Hank who? He says, the boss. And I get on the phone, I said, yeah, how you doing, man? He says, thank God I grew up in an Italian house. I said, why? He says, I did all the right things with the music. He said, it was like I knew all of this all my life, that it was coming to this.
His heritage came out.
Oh,
through
absolutely. And he understood it perfect. It was incredible.
Must have listened to Giuseppe Verdi now and then.
He was in, he and Pete Rugolo, our great friends who wrote for, one of the arrangers that wrote for Stan Kenton in the early years, Pete Rugolo, David Rose, and there's somebody else, and Mancini. They were all in Hawaii with their wives, like vacationing in the early years. And Hank went into a palmist, a fortune teller, and she says, I mean, they just off the street, the four of them. Everybody else went first, and then Hank, and she says, I see a great deal of success in your life. She says, and in your former life, your name was Green.
Which is Verdi, Joe.
Oh my!
You know, which is Italian for green.
2 weeks later,
we call him Joe Green. Joe.
2 weeks later, Hank was and this Hank told me this story. He says 2 weeks later he was in Los Angeles at Universal City, and he was a ghostwriter. He was getting like B movies like The Creature from the Black Lagoon and all that, you know, and Blake Edwards was walking by him, and he says, Hank, he says, I got a new series starting. He said, I'm going to call you next week. He called him next week, Mr. Lucky. And the rest is history.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah. He said, I don't believe in any of that stuff. And
Well,
then he'd
Mark,
look at me,
how
he'd
are you
look at me
putting
and
up with
raise
us this long, man?
I just soaking it in. I love the stories.
And Hank, we'd get on an elevator. Hank was beautiful. Get on an elevator and you hear, Moon River, and you know, and I try not to say anything. And there's a bunch of people around us, and we're all standing there, and nobody knows who Mancini is. You know, we're all standing there, and I'm sort of like, you know, I sort of chuckle, and I look at him, you know, and he look over me at the top of his glasses, and he say, another beach house. He was priceless.
Good deal.
Yeah.
Well, on behalf of Hamilton College, I want to thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your exploits and your insight into the music. So, hope you have a good trip to Europe. And you're back to Toronto sometime soon.
Yeah, I'll be up there. Well, in fact,
Thursday.
we're playing there Thursday,
2 or
but
3
I'm
days.
going up in May again, playing up there for 4 or 5 days, whatever.
Okay. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you
pleasure.
for having us.
Okay.